It's funny, they warned me that the music goes longer than you think, but it really, really does. I was going to start with a moment of gratitude for the organizers, but I think I'll start with a moment of gratitude for each of you. This has been a pretty special day. I go to a lot of events like this. The energy is not usually this electric and vulnerable and welcoming and trusting and wholesome. So just, I guess, round of applause for yourselves. So I'm going to begin with a pop quiz. Anybody want to guess the date of this org chart? Yesterday? It's a good guess. 2015? 1908, 1912. Cool. So 18-something. So there's some range in the guesses in the room. This is from 1920. It's one of the early railroad org charts. If I had shown you a shoe or a dress or a car or a house or an airplane from 1920, do you think you would have been able to guess that it wasn't from today? Yeah. It's very, very strange to me that the main visual instrument by which we visualize how we organize to do all of our most important work, our schools, our governments, our religions, our for-profit, our non-profit organizations, is a thing that hasn't changed while everything else has changed around it. Now, maybe that's because it's perfect. Show of hands if you think it's perfect. Okay, no. So maybe there's another reason. Second pop quiz. It's not all going to be pop quizzes, but we're going to start strong. These are some ideas, some observations, some strategies about how to show up at work that you may have experienced before in a culture that you worked at. Insisting on doing everything through channels, never permitting shortcuts to expedite decisions, referring matters to committees and making sure those committees are as big as possible, haggling over the precise wording of communications, referring back to matters and relitigating things that were decided in the last meeting, maybe over the water cooler or in a one-on-one or in a second meeting. Advocating caution and avoiding that kind of future risk that might happen. And obviously, making sure that there's lots of clearances and procedures around getting anything approved so that 3 people have to approve something when 1 would do. Show of hands, has anyone ever seen an organization that works this way? Yeah, a little bit. So this is from the CIA's manual on simple sabotage that they created during World War II to help companies inside Germany that had confederates of ours, people that were allies, put those companies out of business. So the idea was do these things, and those companies will go out of business, and we can win the war against the Nazis. And now, I read them out loud all around the world, and they have become indistinguishable from modern work. So somewhere between 1940 and today, what used to be things you would do to sabotage a workplace have become what we just all do. And again, I say, this is concerning. So we start to look back at the history of how did this happen? How did we get here? And it goes back much further than 1940. So we go back to where we came from, which is this early craft economy, this artisanal economy, where you were either a master or an apprentice. You were a shoemaker, or you were working with a shoemaker to learn how to make footwear. And this was stuff that you put your heart and soul into. It was a craft. It was a lifelong pursuit. And mastery was the goal. And that was fine if you had to make shoes for the 20 people in your village, or the 200, or maybe even the 2,000. But when we started to scale these nationalist infrastructures, and we started to have highways, and we started to have bigger economies, and we started to have globalization, and certain robber barons decided that they wanted to make a lot more money, it didn't work as well. And the reason it didn't work as well is that if you had a factory full of shoemakers who were master craftsmen making single shoes by themselves, and one of them got sick or wanted a better wage or had an issue with the way you ran the business, then they were really hard to replace because you have to go find a master shoemaker. It won't just matter if you pull any geek off the street. And so they created, with some help of buddies like Frederick Winslow Taylor and Ford and others, this new mental model of work, which was called scientific management. And this was all about dividing the work down into the smallest increments so that we can optimize and turn the crank on the work itself. So instead of being a shoemaker, you're the person that threads the shoelace through the eyelets on the shoe. That's your job. And you need to do that well, because if you don't hit 50 an hour, we're going to fire you. And if you're sick, well, tough shit. And so it's a very, very different model that creates a lot of pressure on the workforce. It also separated the thinkers from the doers. And so they actually, Frederick talked about freeing workers from the tyranny of thinking. Who would want to think at work when you can just be productive? It's a very puritanical ideal. And so they thought they were, socially positive. And it worked in a way, right? It worked really well in the sense that it raised the global standard of living, it raised the quality and the repeatability and the consistency of the products we know and love. The fact that you can get a shoe that fits in a size 8.5, the fact that you can go to McDonald's and get the same hamburger, that your cornflakes are available in every grocery store on earth, that was the result. And in some ways, it was positive, right? In some ways, it created value. And so, Frederick was very excited about what he had done. And so was everybody else. And so for many, many decades after that, we basically turned the handle on this scientific management, this thinking and doing division, this idea that we needed to have managers who were looking at the doers and optimizing their work for them, watching what they did and then slowly changing the chessboard in order to optimize the output. However, over the last few decades, something happened that most people, other than maybe the kind of woke people in the room, didn't really notice as much. And that's that it completely stopped working. So the idea that we can somehow run businesses this way and continue to squeeze more juice out of the orange, that we can pump our legs harder and work really hard to get things done, is no longer delivering returns. And so you look at the rates of return on assets of US firms over the last 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, it's just very much steady down to the right. We no longer know how to get more out of the investment that we have. The assets that we have, we don't know how to put them to work. And in terms of the lifespan of companies, although it's a little bit bumpy on the road, we can all see the slope of the line, right? It's heading from 68 years of an average lifespan of a company on the S&P in the late 50s to about 15 today. And if you remove companies like GE that have been on the list for 122, 124 years, the average is more like 5. So if you're a big, important company or a massive, important institution, the chances that you won't be here in 5 years are 1 in 2, which is crazy pressure. And it hasn't just affected the money side, because I really enjoyed the conversation earlier with folks when we were talking here on the stage about if the goal is just money and growth, then you're kind of broken. Your head isn't screwed on right. It's also about what is the experience of work, of culture? What is the community? What is the connection? What's the meaning behind what we're doing? And it's really failed us there as well. We've heard engagement data today. We've heard about trust today. We've heard about all the sort of fabric of community that is slowly breaking down and making work feel more and more threatening, unsafe, terrible. And gosh, when you add in AI and robotics and automation and joblessness and what's coming, we're not even close to ready. Like we're not even equipped to deal with what's happened to our beautiful model that already doesn't work. And now you're going to add all these other new dynamics. It's going to be a complete failure of the system. Now, interestingly, when I tell people this, and I go around the world, I give this speech everywhere, I ask the leaders, and the leaders say, well, the problem with those charts and the problem with the world is that our people are the problem. We don't have the right people, or our people are too millennial, or not millennial enough. And by the way, shout out to the Xers. They're too millennial, they're not millennial enough, they're not digital enough. There's something wrong with the people. They're not putting their back into it. And then I ask the people, I say, well, what's wrong? And they say, oh, well, it's the leaders. These guys don't know what's going on. They're not talking our language. They're not aligned. They don't share their vision correctly. They're not rewarding the right things. They're the problem. And when you actually look at the organizations that are working well and their philosophy about adaptivity and meaning and abundance at work, it turns out that it's neither of those things. It's not the people. It's not the fish. It's the aquarium. It's the operating system, we refer to it as. It's this idea that inside a business are these simple rules that we've buried down deep, in some cases, I think in many cases, inherited from the people before us, from our parents, from our bosses, from companies we used to work for, even from media. It breaks my heart to think that kids grow up in a world where they watch Devil Wears Prada and say, oh, that's a boss. That's what a boss looks like. That's not what a boss looks like, but that's become the drinking water, right? And so this operating system is made up of principles, of practices, of assumptions, of behaviors that emerge into culture. That's really where it fits with the concept of this conference. So you have things that you've decided, either implicitly or explicitly, about structure, about authority and how it's distributed and how decisions are made, about information and how it flows through the system or doesn't, about how we meet and how we coordinate, our purpose and our values, our policy, our governance, how we make decisions about policy and how we bind our behavior in any way, shape, or form. How we do strategy and innovation. Is it top-down? Is it bottom-up? Is it organic? Is it emergent? how we allocate resources, who gets money, who gets headcount, how do teams decide who gets to do what. And then people development motivation, which could be a box the size of the whole friggin' stage, which is how do people work? How do we motivate them? How do we develop them? How do we engage them? How do we get people to achieve their potential, which has been what so much of the conversation has been about today. And if you think about it like an operating system, if you think about it as a thing that emerges out of some basic coding that we do, some deeply held beliefs, then you start to understand that little choices we make and language that we use and practices that we keep become these massive phenomenological events in culture, right? We say something and then it has meaning. We do something and then it echoes in meaning. So I'll give you an example. This is an operating system that you may have seen before in the sky, right? So this is a murmuration of starlings. And when you look at it, you're like, wow, it's rich, it's beautiful, it's densely, connected. There must be an enormous amount of math that goes into that much wild behavior. And in fact, there's not. There's just 3 simple rules that if you just code those into a computer, you get this exact behavior. And those rules are avoidance, attraction, and alignment. Avoidance means don't bump into anybody. Don't be a jerk. Attraction means, generally speaking, try to keep yourself equidistant from the birds around you. So if they're 10 feet away, you be 10 feet away. If they're 2 feet away, you try to stay 2 feet away. And then alignment means look in the general direction that everyone around you is flying and fly in that direction. Be a team player. Those 3 rules and nothing else emerges into that kind of massive behavior. And so then you think, oh, great. So if we have meetings every week where only the boss talks, how does that play out into the way our flock behaves? If we have language that we use like managers and leaders, which, by the way, I think I heard those words maybe a little bit too much today so far. Those words have meaning. They're richly coded, and they emerge into different patterns of behavior. How we think about trust, how we think about inclusion, how we think about generosity and gratitude, how we think about the spaces that we're in, the space we're in right now, right? We program this space, and then it speaks to us, and we speak to it. So there's this rich interaction. And that is an operating system. So what it means is that we now, as people that are inside these operating systems and becoming aware of the fact that how they're coded, how they're shaped is affecting everything about our modern workplace, we have to take some action. We have to react to this. And so I like to knight people wherever I go, and I'm going to knight you now. Some of you may already self-conceive this way, and good for you. But from here on out, you're org designers, whether you like it or not, whether that's at a community level in terms of how you're organizing politically, whether that's in a family level in terms of how you run your household, if that's an organization that you work at, whether you're a member or whether you're an owner, you're an org designer. And in that way, you have to start thinking about a very simple question, which is, what does good look like? And what is the experience that people are having that I'm having inside this system? How should we work? How should we work across each dimension of that operating system? Now, I'm going to give you a quick pop quiz. So, generally speaking, who likes intersections? Who likes to have intersections instead of roundabouts in their neighborhood? Show of hands. Fans of intersections. Back there, a few. Intersections are nice. Lights are good, right? Who likes a roundabout? Who would prefer a roundabout? Look at that. All right, so a little bit stronger support for roundabout. Which one do you think is safer? Show of hands for intersection. It's got the lights and everything, keeps everybody out of the way. And what about the roundabout? Which one do you think has fewer traffic delays? The lights and then the roundabout? All right. Some people are abstaining from voting. That's fine. Participation is optional. Which one do you think costs less? Intersection? Roundabout? Yeah, interesting. Which one do you think we have more of in the United States? Intersection? Roundabout. Yeah, tricked you on that one. It's true, your instincts are right. And in fact, when I do this with different audiences, there are wildly different opinions around different parts of the country and different parts of the world. But the reality is that this system is inferior in every way to this system. This system reduces accidents by 37%. And by the way, this is American data, not European data where people know how to use a roundabout. This is data from the United States where we have no idea how to use it. 37% reduction in accidents, 90% reduction in fatal accidents, 89% reduction in delays, $10,000 a year in savings. Now, what this tells me is that when we start thinking about org design, we're going to run into these ideas that are unconventionally more successful, that feel uncomfortable or that maybe aren't the norm, but all the data tells us that they're the right thing to do. I'll give you another quick example just so you can sort of inhabit this mindset. This is how people did the high jump for decades. This is the straddle technique. There's also the Western roll, the Eastern scissor. There's a lot of moves. All the moves, by the way, put your parts in precarious contact with the pole. But we did it, you know. We kind of got amped and got over the pole. And then this guy came along in the 60s, Dick Fosbury, and he's like, I have a different idea. I'm going to go over backward. And everybody said, you're insane. And of course, he won the Olympics with this move, and slowly it became the pattern that everybody adopted. For a while, there was this debate of, it works for Dick, but it won't work for us. Right? It's good for you because something about your body's different, but it's not for us. And I feel like when we talk about org design and ways of working and culture, we're in that moment right now where people are like, sure. It works for your culture to be transparent. It works for your culture to have trust and to have, no managers and to be self-organizing. But that's not going to work for us. That's not going to work for us. But in fact, it does. And it feels very uncomfortable to jump over the pole backward for the first time. It's incredibly challenging. So we want to look to people that have jumped over the pole, and we want to start to learn from what they're doing. And some of those people are in this room. Some of those people are out in almost every country that I've visited, in almost every industry. Here's one example. How many people familiar with Bert's.org in the room? A few? Good. Maybe some Reinventing Organizations readers in the house. So Bert's.org is a home nursing healthcare organization in the Netherlands, about 8,000 nurses that run community nursing, and they actually come to the home to deliver the care. The founder noticed that in this category, it had become so driven by the numbers, time on site, patient outcomes, how much medication was doled out, the insurance costs, all that became the metrics. And he said, you know what, for me, this is a calling. I go to help people get better. I don't want to be bound by those things. I'm going to start a new nursing organization where it's up to the nurse to decide what matters and what to measure. And they create these small communities of 10 to 12 nurses in every community they work in where they have complete autonomy and power to decide how to deliver the care, what to measure, when to leave, when to show up, how to handle it. They have a corporate office of 8,000 people in the field, 50 people in the corporate office. And of those, 15 are coaches that are deployed to the field when the field asks for help. So if the field says, we're stuck, they'll deploy a coach with no authority to help. They are the #1 workplace by measurement of employee satisfaction in the Netherlands. And their metrics now, there was a big study by BCG and Accenture, their metrics beat the other nursing organizations on every metric. So they're better in every way, less expensive, better patient outcomes, longer lasting health outcomes, fewer fatalities, all that, without measuring any of that stuff, just by trusting the nurses to give their care. Another cool example from one of our clients, GE in Durham, North Carolina, makes jet engines. If anybody's flown here on an airplane, there's a 50% chance you flew here on a GE engine. 300 people in this factory, one manager. And the manager's basically there to turn the lights off because they don't do anything. Everything is run in the factory by committees that have their own self-organizing principles, their own ways of deciding, their own ways of delegating, their own ways of getting what they need. If somebody's piece of machinery breaks down, they have full authority to order a replacement without any sign-off, without any interaction with any other person. Right? So there's an incredible richness and resiliency to that. And their outcomes in terms of quality, in terms of delivery, in terms of on time, are better than anybody else in the system. So there's really incredible stuff happening in Durham. This is Handelsbanken, the Swedish bank. Had an incredible run over the last 4 decades. They're in the midst of some challenges right now because their CEO is no longer, their founder is no longer the CEO. But essentially what they did is they did the same thing as Bert's.org and said, you know what? Instead of running a bank from the center, let's run it from the edge. So we won't have a customer service line that you call. We'll just call your local branch and let them figure it out. In fact, let's let the local branch figure everything out. They decide what loans to give, who to give them to, at what rate, with what price, through what materials. We'll provide nothing but some basic IT infrastructure, some basic keep the emails running, keep the lights on, but nothing that they don't want to do for themselves, and distribute all that power out to the edge. And what's incredible is that over the last 40 years, in fact, over the last 100 years, if you had invested $10 in both Handelsbanken and GE in 1900, you would have twice as much money in Handelsbanken stock today. Twice the performance of the juggernaut of corporate success. And here's the twist. No budgets, no plans. No targets, no budgets, no plans. Twice the performance over a century of one of the most successful industrials of our time. So what does that tell us? And then lastly, hire. So this is a great example coming out of China. The CEO's gone on a wild kind of vision quest and journey, emotional journey over the last couple decades, and has basically broken the company down into these ZZJYTs, which is shorthand. It's an acronym for some Chinese words that I won't even try to butcher, but essentially what it means is small autonomous unit. And so each group, a single refrigerator, a single microwave, any appliance has its own ZZJYT that makes all those decisions, that deploys to the market. And the talent inside the business is what they call a talent marketplace. It's dynamic. So you can join one, you can jump to another, you can have a portfolio of roles across multiple ZZJYTs. You can move fluidly through the system. They are now the #1 performer in the space, and they have these crazy stories of people flying up through the ranks, being able to provide value that they never would have expected out of different generations. They've got crazy examples of people bringing expertise from one part of the business to another. Everything's going really, really well there. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us here. The rest of us, the folks that maybe haven't spent enough time thinking about this or haven't taken the time to stop and reflect on how we're working, have been designing for efficiency. This idea of scientific management to command and control the hierarchical matrix, centralization, top-down directives, strategic planning, need to know, complicated world that we can figure it out. It's not unknowable. Leaders, managers, all that stuff. And these other ones that we're starting to see defy the rules and the conventions are designing for adaptivity. They're just designing for learning. They're designing for flexibility. It's the same thing that's happening to us as individuals is now happening at an organizational scale. Distributed authority, dynamic teaming, decentralization, emergent leadership, responsiveness, transparency, simple rules, right? That's the delta. Now, nobody's all the way over here, nobody's perfect, and nobody's all the way over there, but there's this pull, this sort of magnetic pull to the right that's calling us right now. And the way to think about it, the last thing I'll offer you, is that really there's 3 organizations when you go to work. There's the formal organization, which you've written down, the rules, the policies, the org chart, however bad it might be, however outdated. The informal organization, which is how things actually get done. You know, people know through the politics, who you know, how to navigate, how to get things done. You have to talk to this person in this department. And then the ideal organization, how we would be if we were organized perfectly and staffed perfectly and optimized for the moment, for the opportunity, for our purpose, right? In organizations that don't get it, that are falling apart, that are falling by the wayside, or not serving us in a dimensional way, the distance between these is huge. The thing they wrote down is a full-on lie. It's wrong. When you ever get org charts from companies and they're like, oh, yeah, ignore page 2, that person's not there anymore, that person's actually a dotted line to that person, right? That's just, it's not accurate anymore. The informal organization is like this shadow org that's doing whatever it can to keep the trains running on time. And the ideal organization is not talked about because people aren't empowered to act on it. They're not empowered to make those changes. In a healthy organization, they're tightly bound together. The thing we wrote down is what we wrote down yesterday. The implicit informal organization is the one we're living in. We're trying that experiment. And the ideal is calling us to do more experiments, to try something else, to listen to the data points of each person in the organization that senses tension and processes that tension into change. So there's a real rich mechanism for keeping these things tighter and tighter together in that learning ideology, that learning mindset. And that really is the difference. There's no end state here. There's no perfection. There's no end of the rainbow. I can't offer you that. What I can say is that continuous participatory change, continuous participation in sensing your way towards the future, towards meaning, towards purpose, towards abundance, towards participation. That is what we're looking for. And once we see that, we know that the future is safe because we know that that organism will sense and respond its way to the future that we all want to live in, that we all want to see. And so that's really the message today, and I hope that the conversations tonight and into tomorrow can start to connect that to what we heard this morning about the individual and start to unpack that into what we're going to do when we all get back home to our families, to our organizations, to our startups, to our communities in the week ahead. So thank you.